The call of the loon. Everybody loves to hear loons in the summer. And kind of an outline of my presentation tonight so you know what's coming and you can form your questions. We'll start with the nesting season and some adorable pictures of loon chicks as they grow. Talk a little bit about migration because it's such an incredible feat of adaptation. I'll share the nest that I was watching this summer. You know, you kind of get a little bit possessive of the loons on your lake or near your home. And we'll talk about loon calls and what they mean, a little bit about behavior and adaptations, and then open it up to your questions. And I really, the part I enjoy most in talking about loons is answering your questions, because usually we can go off on tangents and really get into some of the cool adaptations and behaviors that they have. So, and I do want to give a big shout out and thank you to Loon Watch at Northland College. They helped me gather a bunch of these photos. One of their volunteers, Linda Grenzer, is an amazing photographer, and she very generously has let us use these loon photos for an exhibit and for other things as well. And, you know, I take some photos of loons too, but her photos are just incredible. So enjoy those. We will start with one of my own photos. All spring during lockdown, I was biking up Lake Namakagon as the ice was going out and just waiting for the first day that the loons would show up. There's one little bridge that always has open water first, and I kept watch every single day. It actually took longer than I expected for the loons to arrive. Some years they are on your lake the day that the ice goes out and there's any amount of open water. And they can accomplish this because they will fly as far north as they have open water to swim on and fish on. And then every day they'll scout a little bit farther. And if they find more open water, they'll land and stay there. And if they don't find open water, then they'll go back south as far as they need to find it. So they really do arrive right at the beginning of this season. And they arrive all crisp and beautiful. They go through a full molt down on the ocean. And so they're just bright black and white and smooth and shiny, looking very sexy to attract a new mate when they arrive back on their territory in the spring. And a pair will spend some time bonding, and then they'll get started with the business of nesting. And this is one of the few places that loons actually have a separation of duties. So loon males and females in a pair really split a lot of the parenting duties 50-50. But when they start this spring, the male chooses the nest site. And that's actually a really important fact in their biology and behavior. And then the female builds the nest and she lays the eggs, obviously. So they have to have those separation of duties. But the fact that the male chooses the nest site is very important. And we'll talk about that more later on with territoriality. So their nest site also has to be pretty close to the water. You know, they can't walk very well. So you can see this one, she would be able to dive off and escape by swimming really easily, which is definitely helpful. It also makes them vulnerable to boat wakes or rising water levels and other challenges. So it's really important for us to protect our shorelines that have loon nests. So a few years ago, I had a group fortuitously request a special loon pontoon tour on Memorial Day weekend on Lake Owen. And we were able to watch a loon pair switch places on the nest. One loon had been preening, and then he came over and took his turn at the nest. And before he settled in, he actually turned the eggs. And so you could see him use his feet to roll them over so that it doesn't stick to the inside. But I didn't even realize that I got this photo until I got it back to my computer and zoomed in. And then I was pretty thrilled that you could see 2 eggs under his little fluffy tush. So loons almost always lay 2 eggs. Very, very occasionally there have been reports of 3 eggs. And then more commonly, they'll lay one egg, especially if it's a second nest attempt, or maybe the female was in poor condition or something like that. And they will only re-nest if the eggs fail at the egg stage. Once they hatch, their hormones change and they won't lay eggs again. But if just the eggs fail, then they can try again. So now come the really adorable photos from Linda Grenzer. She has chicks of known ages she's taken photos of. So they hatch in with 24 hours. As soon as their little downy feathers dry out, they are on the water and they never return to the nest at all. Their parents usually lead them away to a nursery area nearby. So shallow, weedy, protected from wind and waves, and lots of small minnows and things for them to eat. I'll make a good nursery. And at this point, you know, they can't really dive. They pop back up like a little bobber, and their feathers also aren't good at keeping them very warm or dry. And so, so cute. They'll follow their parents around and swim for a little while, and then climb on their parents' back for protection, for warmth, for rest, all of those things. And this is, I think, the stage that most people are really in love with loons and loon babies. They're pretty adorable. And they do this only for the first 2 weeks, and then they're too big. But for the first 2 weeks, they can be adorable like this. So as they grow, their parents are feeding them. And at first, they get fed just either small minnows or large aquatic insects that are already dead and just handed right to the chicks. But as they grow older and older, the parents have them on kind of a training regimen, just like we have grade levels in our education system too. You know, they'll get a minnow that is only stunned and not fully dead. And then they'll get a minnow that can still swim a little bit, and they'll have to catch it. And if they miss, the parent will grab the minnow and hand it back to them. And so they get trained on feeding as they grow. So, you know, and they often have 2 chicks. And if there isn't enough food to go around, the slightly older chick will be a little bit of a bully and will push its way to the front to get food. And sometimes that slightly younger chick, usually about a day younger, because they lay the eggs 24 hours apart and then start incubating immediately. So one chick usually hatches a day before the other, and that younger one sometimes gets pushed out of the way and starves. But if there's enough food, then they will both survive. As they get even more awkward looking. And chicks are really vulnerable to a lot of different things. You know, muskies and northern pike, snapping turtles are all made out as villains a lot of time in a pond ecosystem because they can grab the chicks from below. But eagles are also a known predator of loon chicks. And so there's a lot of dangers out there for them. So by the time they're 5 weeks old, they're doing pretty well. And once they hit 6 weeks, if you have both chicks still alive, they are both probably going to survive to the rest of the summer. So 6 weeks is kind of a tipping point, both in sort of chick maturity and a loss of cuteness. You know, they start looking more awkward as they end up being, you know, preteens there with a funny hairdo and stuff. So you just gotta chuckle at how they change as they grow up. Definitely having a bad hair day then. So yeah, they're growing some of their juvenile feathers by this age. And by 2 months old, they can actually catch most of their own food if they want to. Although in all of my observing loon families on my loon pontoon tours, I found that the chicks are quite willing to just sit there and get fed by their parents and have their parents bring them snacks constantly. But they could survive on their own if they had to. And case in point, so there's a juvenile loon who caught itself a bluegill. Not too shabby. So, you know, it takes loons a while to grow up, and that impacts their migration schedule too. So juvenile chicks stick around and gain wing strength until November, and then they migrate by themselves without their parents with them. So that's a pretty incredible feat. And this plumage, the brown and the white, that is how the loon chicks, the juveniles, will look for 3 to 4 years while they spend time on the ocean growing up and getting stronger and maturing. And the adults also look like this when they are on the ocean in the winter. So if you ever go visit Florida or California, somewhere on the coast, you may see a loon that looks like this, and it might be juvenile or it might be an adult in non-breeding plumage. So, and in early fall, you can watch the adults change too. They are getting ready to molt, and some of their head feathers tend to go first, so they get a little white on their chin. But they can't molt their flight feathers until they're down on the ocean, because if they lose any of their feathers, their flight feathers, then they won't be able to fly. They're on the cutting edge of not being able to fly because they're such a heavy bird. But their faces start to turn white. And another thing I've noticed up here is the loons who live on very brown, tanniny lakes, their chest starts to get stained and orange by the end of the summer. On really clear lakes like Lake Owen, they stay pure white all summer long though. And the other part of the phenology is when they migrate. So in general, bachelor loons who have no children will migrate as early as August. And I've already heard reports of rafts of loons gathering. So bachelor loons coming together on a bigger lake to fish together. And there was, I don't know, 8 or 9 loons together all at once already. And that's really becomes more and more common through August. And then they can start migrating pretty much whenever they feel like it. They're not gonna do any territorial battling this late in the summer. And then in September, it's the mothers who leave, the female loons who had successful chicks. They start heading south to the ocean so they can regain body condition and get ready for laying eggs next year. And then in October is when the fathers migrate south, and then November is when the chicks head out. So there they are, a couple of juvenile siblings still hanging out in late fall. And their migration routes are really interesting. They definitely, you know, from certain parts of the North Country, they tend to go to certain places on the coast. And our loons tend to head to the west coast of Florida. So you can see there some of the different migration routes. In order to spend the winter, they just need ice-free water where they can feed. And it needs to be clear enough that they can see the fish. They're visual hunters, so they need at least 3 feet of visibility in front of them. And so some of the lakes in those southern states might stay ice-free all winter, but they might not have enough visibility for the loons to hunt. And the cold doesn't bother them. You know, you can see they're all the way up into Alaska and Maine over winter, and that's not a warm place. The Gulf of Maine in January is not a warm place, but it doesn't matter to the loons as long as there's not ice and they can go fishing. So here are some specific routes of loons that were tagged around here, and the flyways they took down to their wintering grounds. So there's definitely some variation, and not all of our loons go to the same neighborhood in Florida. So this spring, I had the joy of watching a nest near my house. You know, Linda Grenzer got some amazing photos of chicks. Well, I had my own experience, and as I was biking past the County D boat landing one evening, I looked out and saw the very distinctive silhouette of a loon on a nest, and I was so thrilled. But the very next day, I went out there again, And there was the nest and the 2 eggs, and it was just swarmed with black flies. And the next slide is a video. We'll see if it actually, you can see just how disgusting it was, this absolute cloud of black flies as I was floating around it in my kayak. And that's really a problem for loons. Oh, let's see, we'll go back to this picture. So there is a species of black fly that is specific to loons, and it won't actually bite humans. A couple of these landed on me, but none of them tried to bite me. And one hypothesis is that they are attracted to loons and identify loons by the scent of the oil in their preen gland. And that's how they know it's a loon. And that makes sense, because I was reading something about, black flies in humans, and they find us by scent as well. And my mom uses really good Mexican vanilla as a black fly bug repellent. And I wonder if that doesn't just disguise our human scent that our species of black flies is tuned into. So loons, some springs, and it's cold springs especially, compress the black fly season all into a short period. So tons and tons of black flies hatch all at once, and they just absolutely make the loons' lives miserable. I won't repeat the description that Marge Gibson told me about how bad some loons were this year, because it just makes your skin crawl. But they get chased off the nest because they just can't tolerate it. They will actually get blood poisoning from all of the black fly bites. So they swim away, they dive, and the eggs fail. But then in 2 weeks, it's all fine. The black flies die back, and I came back 2 weeks later, and the loon was pulling vegetation around her. I didn't have a tripod, so sorry if you get seasick, but the loon was pulling vegetation and building up the nest again. So right on time, they were attempting a second nest, which was super exciting. And I continued to watch as the adults incubated the eggs for 27 days. The average is 26. And during that time, it was really fun to watch the vegetation on their little island grow too. And the yellow iris is out there. But then 27 days, I went out and there were no loons. There were broken eggshells in the nest. There they are. But I was hoping to also find the adult and 2 chicks. This is a picture from Cisco Lake recently. And instead, I just found 2 adults by themselves. So the chicks hatched and then somehow didn't make it over to the nursery area. So I was very excited to watch a loon nest this spring. And like so many others, like about 50% of the nests, they didn't survive. So I was pretty bummed. So that was my loon nest this spring. So I titled this presentation The Call of the Loon. So we will go over the calls, and the calls also offer a good way to kind of tell some more about their behavioral adaptations as well. So I have the loon calls I use on my loon pontoon tour, a little recorder here. So I'll hold it up to my speaker, and that should work for you. So the wail is their long distance communication, and it often gets mistaken for a wolf howl. So we've all heard that multiple times here up north. And loons use that to talk to their mates. So if one of the pair is on the nest and they're getting hungry and tired and they want a break, they can call their mate back using the wail if their mate is out feeding themselves somewhere further away. Or if there's danger nearby, sometimes they'll call their mate in as reinforcements. They also communicate with their neighbors using the wail. And if you're lucky enough to live in an area with a bunch of lakes all together, you can sometimes hear one loon wail from over here and one loon wail from over here. It's often in the evening, and another will answer from a different lake. And we have this tendency to think, oh, that's so sweet. They're, you know, they're wishing each other good night, or they're talking nicely, but it actually is really passive aggressive, because they are trying to make sure that their neighbors are where they're supposed to be and not where they're not supposed to be, and that all the territories are still occupied, because an unoccupied territory could mean you could go grab it. So they're really keeping track of each other and keeping tabs on each other. So if you don't participate in that evening chorus, somebody might come down to your territory thinking it's free and open. So everybody's got to respond, but then they all keep track of each other too. So that's the wail. Let's see. Oh, there we go. And the hoot is their short distance communication. And sounds like this. Oops, that's not it. So how many of you have ever heard a hoot? Can you raise your hand in the video? Yeah, a couple of you at least. Yeah, you're lucky if you have, because you only get to hear it if you're close and if they're not too scared of you and not too worried about you. So they use it to talk to their chicks. They use it to talk to their mate when they're close by. And I have often, during snack time on the water, watched the parent come up with a minnow in their mouth, and the chick is like off in la la land, you know, and so the parent has to hoot to be like, hey, come over here and get your dinner. So they use it for all sorts of close distance communication. And the tremolo. This is their alarm call. So if you're too close, or if there's another danger, another animal nearby that's bothering them, or another loon that's threatening them, oftentimes they'll give the tremolo call as an alarm call, as a warning. And it also has another purpose when they're flying. So they can also give the tremolo as a flight call as they're flying over lakes. And then it acts as their doorbell, which is kind of fun. So if you hear them, it's always so thrilling. It sounds more energetic when they're flying, I think. But if a prospecting loon, or a floating loon, one that doesn't have a territory of their own, is flying over a lake and wants to land and feed, or maybe even land and grab a territory, they can ring the doorbell. So they can give a tremolo, and if there isn't a loon on the lake, or if there is a loon on the lake but they're not a territorial loon, if they're just another float or two, they'll be silent. But if the loon on the lake is a territorial male, then he will respond to the doorbell tremolo with a yodel. So that is their most intense call for sure. So that is a territorial male. The females don't make that call, and he is saying, hey, this is my territory. If you land, you have to be prepared to fight. So now the invading, the flying loon has a decision to make. And the sound of that yodel actually helps him make that decision, because the bigger the loon, the lower his voice. And so if you're flying over and the loon on the lake gives a really deep, low yodel, you can say, maybe I don't want to fight this guy. Or if it's a little bit of a higher pitched yodel, oh, sure, I can totally take him. And then they can land, and potentially a territorial battle will ensue. So their calls are a really interesting way of sort of testing each other. So, I realized I had a specific slide for that. So the in-flight tremolo is the doorbell. And then their yodel is so intense. Really important for territorial battles. And then their territorial disputes, 30% of the time end in the death of the resident male. So 30% of the time, the resident male will actually fight to the death in a territorial dispute. And that is fairly unusual. You know, you think about white-tailed deer, they have antlers so that they don't have to fight. They just look big and mean, and they can avoid that physical contact. But for loons, this all comes back to the fact that the males choose the nest location. And that is really valuable information connected to that specific territory. So the first year on a territory, a male's nesting success is 40% or less. But each subsequent year, he increases his nest success up to over 60%. And so he really wants to hold on to that territory and that local knowledge, because he's the one who has to choose the nest site and choose a site that won't get raided by raccoons or flooded out by waves or other things like that. So he's willing to fight to the bitter end, whereas the invading male pretty much never fights to the death. I suppose there's a possibility they swim off somewhere and die of injuries, but for the most part they give up before they get to that point, because they can just go somewhere else. They aren't losing as much. And when you think about a territorial dispute, their most formidable weapons are their beak. And you can see there's a lot of wing flapping in this picture. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, hopefully this doesn't ruin anything, and show you the first of my dead loon parts. So here is a loon's skull we got from a loon that the DNR picked up, and you can see that beak is just really intense. And then this is the breastbone of a dead loon, obviously. And you can see this hole right here with one bigger hole and one smaller part of the hole. So those were made by the beak of another loon. So this loon, the one that died, was swimming. The other loon swam straight up and got enough force, enough momentum going that it could actually puncture a hole in the breastbone of the other loon. So 30% of the time, territorial disputes end in the death of the resident male, and that is sometimes how it works. Go back to my slideshow. Oh. All right, so we talked about the yodels and how the bigger the loon, the deeper the voice. So this is a quiz I give to fourth graders, and maybe you guys can figure it out too. So which of these loons, so these are sonograms, pictures made of the loon's yodels, which of these loons is bigger? And if you look, it is loon 2 is the bigger loon. It has a deeper voice. And I actually can play that for you. Here's the first one. And here is the second one. So you can hear how the bigger loon has the lower voice, and also see that on the sonogram. So they're yodels, and part of the reason that we can do this, look at the pictures and tell something about the loons, is because each male has his own unique yodel, and they can tell each other apart. What's also really fascinating about their yodels is they can change it in the middle of their life. A lot of birds learn their bird song and that's it. You know, they have a specific window of brain development when they can learn new songs and then they stop. Well, loons can change their yodel at any time. And so when a new loon comes in and wins a territory, he will change his yodel to be as different from the previous resident male's yodel while still being within the norms for the neighborhood, so he doesn't sound like a weirdo. And that's a pretty incredible talent. So here's your challenge. There's 3 yodels, and your job is to figure out if there's 1, 2, or 3 different loons represented with these 3 different yodels. So I'll play them for you. Here's loon 1, line 1. And here's line 2. And here is line 3. Okay, now in your video, hold up the number of fingers you think there are of different loons represented here. So is it 3 different birds? Is it 2 different birds? Is it 1 different bird? So the answer is it is 3 different birds. So these are 3 entirely different loons. And what I look at to tell are these first notes. So the little staircase leading up to the yodel is often pretty different. And then if you skip to the last note, that's often a good place to look at where the pitch is and if there's this extra noise going on. And those are good clues. I don't have a very good musical ear to hear the differences myself, but I find it easier to see the differences on the sonogram. So it's pretty interesting that they're all different individuals. So now here's one more challenge. This is like Sesame Street. Which one of these is not like the other one? So there are only 2 individuals in this set, but which of the lines are the same and which of the lines are the different loon? And maybe I'll have you guys do it just by sight this time instead, because the yodel calls can be kind of irritating to listen to, too long too. So take a look at the sonograms. Remember to look at that first staircase up and then that very last note. And then which of the lines is the odd one out? Yep, number 3. Good job, guys. You're figuring it out. And you can see that especially on this one, the last note is that M shape, whereas down here it's a flat shape. So pretty neat research that scientists did to figure out how different all the different yodels were. All right, so folks often ask me about numbers, the loon numbers, and I'm not very good at remembering numbers, so I put them all on a slide for you. Their wingspan is 5 feet. They can weigh 6 to 13 pounds, but an average of 10. They can fly an average of 70 miles an hour. They can fly faster than that too. But if they get below like 65 or 60 miles an hour, they stall out. So just like an airplane, they have to be going fast enough in order to stay up in flight to have enough lift. You know, the minimum lake size, 10 acres, but really it's determined by the amount of food, and they don't like to be able to see another pair while they're on their territory. So a lot of it is about sight lines. If there's a perfectly round lake, you're going to fit fewer loons on it than if you have a really odd-shaped lake with lots of neat little bays that break up the sight lines and allow more loons to hang out without seeing each other. And they're really long-lived birds, you know, 25 to 30 years. So that's pretty amazing for a bird of their size, and that really impacts how they live, you know, it impacts how much energy they put into just having 2 chicks versus a merganser, which doesn't live as long and, you know, throws 16 chicks into the world at once, and most of them die. So it's a different life strategy. And in Wisconsin, we have over 3,000 loons, which is pretty great. And just last Saturday, we did the every 5-year loon population survey to check again if the numbers are going up or going down or holding stable. A couple adaptations before we open up to questions. So one of the most common ones you'll see is the foot waggle. And scientists call this a comfort move, which means that the bird does it to improve their comfort. It could be a stretch, it could be temperature regulation, because that skin on their feet allows them to either get rid of excess heat or even warm up their toes if the water is too cold. And it's also thought that they might be shaking the water off before tucking that foot up under their wing. Just like a heron might stand on one foot while they're waiting, a loon might swim with just one foot in the water too. And the foot waggle is really useful to researchers because if you band their leg, then with just color bands, then with binoculars, you can see those color bands when they do the foot waggle and identify the loon. Peering is another common behavior we see, and this is basically like snorkeling. So a loon needs to be aware of what's up above in the air and what's below in the water. And so to get past the glare on the surface, they stick their face in and look down. This is often a hunting behavior, but sometimes if they're in a group with a lot of loons, they peer to keep track of what their buddies are doing or their enemies are doing down below. And preening. So I have a kind of an entertaining series of pictures here. So they do a lot of preening, looking to make sure nobody's going to see them as they go into their awkward positions. They can flush water through their feathers and wash out the dust, wash out the mites, really going at it. A lot of people mistake this for a loon that's in distress, but really they're just taking a very vigorous bath. And then they comb oil through their feathers. They have a preen gland on their back, and they grab oil from that in their beak and comb it through all of their feathers, zip all of those little feather parts together again, and they can really do some awkward positions. Of course, they can't reach the back of their head with their beaks, so they rub the back of their head directly onto the preen gland to get oil onto that. So a little bit of yoga for you there. And then at the end of it all, they do a wing flap. And of course, this is every photographer's dream. I didn't quite catch it at its height, but the wing flap is another comfort move. They often do it at the end of preening to get all their feathers back into place, but they might do it at other times too, just like we might stretch because we feel like it. Some cute pictures for you. This was recently on the loon population survey. Adorable chicks nestled into mom or dad's back. And can you spot the second chick? So one chick is on top of the back, and the other one is just beyond mom or dad's tail. Just a little bit of fuzz there. So once they don't fit on the back anymore, they kind of get tucked in the headlock under the wing in order to kind of get dragged along with the parents so they don't float off. So there we go, there's the second chick became visible there. So loons are just so fun to watch, so fun to learn about. They have so many cool adaptations and behaviors. And there's we have common loons here, but there's a lot of different loons, or several different loons in the world. So when I went up to Alaska in 2018, my goal was to see some of the different species of loons. And on Toolik Lake, you can see that's up in the Brooks Range, north of the Brooks Range, on the Dalton Highway, there was a pair of breeding yellow-billed loons feeding their chick, which was very fun to see. They look very similar to our common loons, but they're bigger and they have yellow bills. I also, just south of Prudhoe Bay, was able to capture a photo of a red-throated loon, and they are the smallest loon, and they're the only loon that can take off without a huge runway. Our common loon needs a quarter-mile runway in order to get going. And the red-throated loon, this one was on a tiny little puddle in the tundra, so it doesn't need that big runway. And then going out of the harbor in Homer, I saw a Pacific loon too, just swimming around the corner. So pretty thrilled to see that. So the only one I'm missing is the Arctic loon, which is, as its name suggests, is way far up there. So a little bit harder to see. So there they are on the loon. And that is my slideshow. So now I want to open it up to questions. I see there's a few things in the chat. One question is, what lakes do you guys do on the Loon pontoon tours? And we currently have drivers taking us out on both Lake Namakagon and Lake Owen. Those are our most frequent Loon pontoon tour lakes. And we recently, well, before the pandemic, we added the Chippewa flowage to our Loon pontoon schedule as well. And so next summer we'll be trying to do that again, because that's such a fascinating lake with so much history too. Is the loon population stable in Wisconsin? What about North America? You know, in the last 5-year population survey, so 5 years ago in 2015, the population was stable or slightly increasing in Wisconsin. And I think that's the case across the country, although there's a lot of worry that it's kind of the calm before the storm. And as climate change really impacts our lakes, folks are expecting loons to get pushed farther north, like most species, and definitely not survive as temperatures rise. Farther, lakes get shallower, more algae blooms impact visibility and things like that. And even right now, there's a researcher, Walter Piper, who's doing a bunch of loon studies over in the Mercer area, and he has a very small area but very intensely studied loons. He has a lot of them banded, and they really know the individuals. And what he's been finding is that there are basically the same number of pairs, but there are fewer floaters. And what that means is that if a resident loon, a nesting loon, dies, there's not as many loons sort of waiting in the wings to take their place. Whereas in the past, there would be any number of floaters ready to just swoop in and start breeding on that lake. And the other trend that he's noticing is that there's more one chick broods, more broods with just one chick, and the chicks are smaller and underweight. And he's wondering if sort of the populations of small fish and minnows aren't a part of that problem. So we're hopeful that loons are pretty stable, but there's some signs that they might be on the edge of a decline. So anything we can do to help is great. And one of the easiest things that anyone can do is to switch away from lead fishing tackle and use the non-toxic fishing tackle, because loons have a gizzard. They like to swallow little rocks to help them grind their food, and a lead sinker looks like the perfect gizzard stone. But then they digest it and it goes into their blood, and it's a slow and painful death. They can actually dissolve a fish hook in their stomach pretty easily. The steel fish hook is not a problem at all. It's the lead that's really the problem. And if you find a loon that is sick with lead poisoning, there are ways you can take it to rehab, and oftentimes they can help it recover, but many of them don't get to rehab. Describe a banding episode. So this is on my bucket list. I have not yet gone out with researchers to do the banding, but I definitely will someday. And I have seen pictures and I've heard about it. And basically it can only be done, from what I understand, in that kind of first 2 weeks of a chick's life when they can't dive very well. And so the researchers go out after dark with a spotlight and they net the chicks and get them onto the boat. And then the parents stick right close to the boat so that the researchers can also get them in the net. without the chicks there, the adult loons would just dive away. You know, they have the perfect escape route. So they get the adult loons in the net, everybody's wearing eye protection, and you cover that loon beak right away because that is their most formidable weapon. And then, you know, they get a blood test, which is the only way, one of the only ways to really get to know for certain if it's a male or a female loon. The only other way we can really know for certain is if we hear it yodel. Otherwise, they look exactly alike. So they'll do some blood work and put the color bands, 2 color bands on each leg, onto the loon, and then let them go. Seems pretty exciting and also exhausting because you're out way past your bedtime. So whenever I find a researcher to invite me out on a banding trip, you can bet that I will write about it in my Natural Connections.